Okay, now we're going to pick up with the New Deal. I mentioned just before in the first 100 days that FDR was able to get in an enormous amount of legislation. In fact, it was so numerous that the laws and agencies were commonly referred to by their initials. And this is the alphabet soup period of American history. Please make note of what the organizations and the agencies are called, and don't rely solely upon their abbreviations, please. So, the first New Deal, we start out with a bank holiday, and it's to restore confidence in the banking system. Early 1933, banks were failing at a frightening rate. Okay, as depositors are flocking to withdraw their funds, many banks can't meet the withdrawals, and they fail in 1933. It's somewhere around over 5,000 had failed in all previous years of the Depression. So to restore confidence in those banks that were still solvent and still, able to meet obligations, the president ordered the banks closed for a bank holiday. This was March 6, 1933. He went on the radio. He explained that the banks would be reopened after allowing enough time for the government to reorganize them on a sound basis. The next thing was to repeal prohibition. FDR kept a campaign promise by enacting a repeal of prohibition. It was a money-making venture. It raised needed tax money by having Congress pass what was called the Beer, Wine, Revenue Act, which legalized the sale of beer and wine. Later, the 21st Amendment would be pushed through and repeal the 18th Amendment, bringing prohibition to an end. FDR also starts fireside chats to restore confidence in the government. He went on the radio March 12, 1933, and this is the first of many what he called fireside chats to the American people. He's assuring listeners and reassuring listeners that the banks that reopened after the holiday were now safe. And the public responds with a lot of hope and began depositing into the reopened banks. Now, financial recovery programs were pushed through. The Emergency Banking Relief Act. It authorizes the government to examine the finances of banks that were closed during the bank holiday and reopen those that they judge to be sound. So it's oversight for the banks. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, we're familiar with it now, but prior to it passing in the 30s, we were not, and that's why so many banks failed, so many people lost their money. The FDIC guarantees individual bank deposits up to $5,000. That rate is significantly higher today. Now, Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, provided refinancing of small homes to prevent foreclosures. Welcome to a bank bailout. Welcome to a homeowner's bailout. The Farm Credit Administration provides low-interest farm loans and mortgages to prevent foreclosures on the property of indebted farmers. So it's very similar to the homeowners, only it's a farm support. Now, other programs. Programs for the relief of the unemployed. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, offered outright grants of federal money to states and local governments that were operating soup kitchens and other forms of relief for the jobless and homeless. The director of FERA was Harry Hopkins. He was a close friend of the president. Another one, the Public Works Administration, the PWA. It was directed by Secretary of Interior Harold Ickes. It allotted money to state and local governments for building roads, bridges, dams, other public works. And these construction projects were a source of just thousands of jobs for people. Put people to work, they earn money. The Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC employed young men on projects on federal lands, paid their families small monthly sums. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the National Park Service, all of those are trying to put people to work, give them some way of making some money. And then there's the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. A huge experiment in regional development and public planning was rather successful. TVA is still in operation today. Florence, Alabama, one major TVA city. Tupelo, Mississippi is another one. As a government corporation, it hired thousands of people in one of the nation's poorest regions. You can see that northern Alabama area there and going into Tennessee. And this Tennessee Valley region was one of the poorest in the country, and thousands were hired to build dams, operate electric power plants, control flooding and erosion, manufacture fertilizer. Many of these dams and electric power plants are still in operation today. The TVA sold electricity to residents of the region at rates that were well below those previously charged. So it puts people to work on working projects. It redoes the power grid for those particular areas, and it offers cheaper to the consumer. So it's a benefit for many different individuals. There's also an industrial recovery, the National Recovery Administration, NRA. 1932, this was a key measure to combine immediate relief with long-term reform. The director was Hugh Johnson. It was an attempt to guarantee reasonable profits for businesses, fair wages, and hours for labor. With antitrust laws that had been temporarily suspended, so the NRA could help industry, steel, oil, paper. They could set codes for wages, hours for work, levels of production, and also prices of finished goods. It was government regulation at its finest. The law creating the NRA also gave workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. Supreme Court would later step in and declare the NRA unconstitutional. Farm production control. It established the AAA or AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, encouraging farmers to reduce production and boost prices. And they did this by offering government subsidies or price supports. This too was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court later in 1935. Another of the alphabet soup, the CWA, the SEC, the FHA. The Civil Works Administration was added to the PWA, the Public Works Administration, and creating jobs, hiring labor for temporary construction projects. The Securities and Exchange created to oversee the stock market and limit speculative stock prices. And then the FHA for housing support, bank loans for housing, to try to boost those bank loans for building and repair as well. And then, of course, the nation comes off the gold standard. And this was another effort to halt deflation, the falling prices, and value of the dollar set at $35 per ounce, but you could no longer trade in your dollars for gold. And so we're now moving into the era of faith-based money. We still have the idea of being backed by gold and the idea of this is how much it's worth, but it still comes down to how much, what the faith is within the money. Now, the second New Deal focuses on relief and reform, where the first had focused on recovery. We continue with the alphabet soup. The Works Progress Administration was spending billions of dollars to provide people with jobs. WPA workers were put to work on constructing new bridges, roads, airports, public buildings. Unemployed artists, writers, and actors were paid to paint murals, write histories, perform plays. It was major investment in America and arts of America and building of America. One part of the WPA was the National Youth Administration, the NYA, providing part-time jobs to help young people stay in high school and college or until they could get a job with a private employer. We also have the RA, the Resettlement Administration, and they're providing loans to sharecroppers, tenants, small farmers, in hopes that they would also be able to establish federal camps where migrant workers could find decent housing. Then we have the National Labor Relations. You'll probably see this referred to as the Wagner Act, labor law of 1935 replacing labor provisions of the National Industrial Recovery Act. And the Wagner Act guaranteed a worker's right to join a union and a union's right to bargain collectively. Now we also have the It outlawed business practices that were unfair to labor and created a new agency, the National Labor Relations Board, empowered to enforce the law, make sure that workers' rights are protected. We have the REA for Rural Electrification Administration, exactly what it is, supplying power to rural areas. And then federal taxes were increased. A Revenue Act of 1935 significantly increased the taxes on incomes of the wealthy few. It increased the tax on large gifts from parent to child and on capital gains or profits from the sale of stocks and other properties. Now, coming out of this second New Deal is also the Social Security Act. We're facing this one today, so you can really hit in on that changes through time. 1935, Social Security Act, federal insurance program set up for retirees, setting the age at 65, and it's basically a tax out of each month's check from both the person who is working and their employer. It also deals with unemployment compensation, disability, and dependent child and mother care as well. Now, the opposition, FDR was not without opposition. Charles E. Coughlin, Catholic priest, founded the National Union for Social Justice. He attacks the New Deal. He was considered anti-Semitic and fascist and told to stop. Francis Townsend. He proposes a plan that is basically the predecessor to FDR's Social Security plan, and FDR, revamps it a little bit, comes up with the Social Security system. The biggest opposition for FDR was Huey Long. He was, from Roosevelt's point of view, the most dangerous of the Depression demagogues. He was the kingfish from Louisiana, as he was referred. Very popular in Louisiana. He became a national figure in proposing Share Our Wealth, promising minimum annual income $5,000 for every American family. Huey Long challenged Roosevelt's leadership of the Democratic Party, announcing his candidacy for president. Both his candidacy and his popularity came to an end when he was killed by an assassin. Probably worth a little bit more research. Court packing. This is going to be a negative for FDR. Okay, FDR experiences opposition from the Supreme Court, and he proposes a court packing deal, proposing that the president be authorized to appoint to the Supreme Court additional justices for every justice who was older than 70 and a half years. In effect, the bill would have allowed Roosevelt to add up to 6 new justices. The reaction was extremely negative. Republicans and many Democrats were outraged by what they saw as an attempt to tamper with checks and balances. For the first time in Roosevelt's presidency, a major bill he proposed went down to a decisive defeat by Congress. Now, another one is the Fair Labor Standards Act, political victory for organized labor, establishing minimum wage, maximum work week, and even the child labor restrictions. And this comes through in 1938. Now, unfortunately, the last phase of the New Deal, we end up in a recession from 1937 to 1938. From 33 to 37, Roosevelt's first term, the economy showed signs of gradually pulling out. Banks were stable, business earnings were moving up. Winter of 1937, economy once again takes a slide. Government policy is partly to blame with this, but the New Deal had been weakened. Although the economy had improved, there was no boom and problems remained. Court packing fight of 1937, the people and Congress no longer automatically followed FDR. 1938 elections bring a reduced Democratic majority in Congress. Coalition of Republicans and conservative Democrats block further New Deal reforms, but the beginning in 1938, fears are about an aggressive act of Nazi Germany, and that begins to divert attention from domestic concerns into foreign affairs, and ultimately it's going to be World War II that brings us out of the Great Depression.